In the second part of this training module, we look now at the stresses affecting yield formation. We will consider stresses during the yield formation, during flowering, and before the reproductive phase. Let's start with the water stresses during yield formation. When we have water stress during the yield formation, the harvest index can get adjusted. It can increase or decrease. The upward or downward adjustment depends when the stresses occur and how severe they are. Let us first look at the positive effect on the harvest index. That is when water stresses affect leaf growth. It's only possible, of course, when vegetative growth is still possible. Hence, we have to make that distinctions between the determined and the indeterminate crops. When water stress affects leaf growth, but the stomata are not yet closed, the carbohydrates are then used to fill the grains instead of making new leaves. This results in a positive and upward adjustment of the harvest index. How strong that is? That depends first of all on the magnitude of the stress. Secondly, on the crop type. It is conservative crop parameter. And of course on the length of the period of potential vegetative growth, which is somewhat limited for the determined crop, but can extend till senescence for the indeterminate crops. However, when during the yield formation water stress affects stomatal closure, less CO2 can be taken up, less carbohydrates can be produced, and as such there is less material to fill the grains, and this results in a decline of the harvest index. Once again, the reduction in the harvest index depends on the magnitude of the stress and the crop type, which is described by conservative crop parameters. So as a summary, the total effect of water stress on the harvest index during yield formation depends on the sensitivity of the crop, these are the crop parameters, the environmental conditions and the magnitude of the water stress. So if we have a mild stress, which affects the leaf expansion growth, but not the stomatal closure, the harvest index will increase, for example, by 10%. When we have a moderate stress, when the water content in the root zone is below the green and the red threshold, the green threshold is for leaf expansion growth and the red threshold for stomatal closure, we have on the one hand an increase of the harvest index because the leaves cannot expand, but on the other hand a decrease of the harvest index because less assimilates can go to the grain. As such, the harvest index is not adjusted. When the water stress is very severe, when the water content in the root zone is far below the threshold for stomatal closure, we have a positive increase because the leaves cannot expand, but a very negative increase because stomata are nearly fully closed already. As such, nearly no assimilates are produced. This results in a decline of the harvest index. To summarize, water stresses affecting leaf growth can result in an increase of the harvest index, while water stresses affecting stomatal closure will result in a reduction of the harvest index. Let's now discuss the stresses during flowering. During flowering, water stress and temperature stress might result in a failure of pollination. As such, we have less flowers, and as such, the harvest index might go down. If the harvest index goes down, depends on the amount of flowers which were not pollinated. Here we see the fraction of total flowers flowering during the flowering period. Actually, the crop made too much flowers. There is always an excess of flowers, given here in dark green, which are not necessary to make the potential fruits. If we have now a stressed period, it can be water stress, it can be cold or heat stress. The impact on harvest index depends on the amount of flowers which were not pollinated. If at the end of flowering sufficient flowers were still pollinated to have the potential fruits, then the harvest index is not affected. However, when the stressed period is long and severe, the total amount of flowers which were pollinated might not be sufficient to have the potential fruits, and at that moment the harvest index will decline. So the failure of pollination will occur under severe water stress. So AquaCrop consider also a threshold which affects the pollination. If the water content drops below that threshold, we have failure of pollination. The threshold is a conservative crop parameter. In case of failure of pollination due cold stress, AquaCrop consider a threshold for a temperature. If the minimum air temperature drop below that threshold, we have failure of pollination. The same is true for heat stress. AquaCrop consider another temperature threshold, and if the maximum air temperature exceeds that threshold, they have failure of pollination. The threshold for the maximum and the minimum air temperature are once again conservative crop parameters. Stresses during flowering might result in failure of pollination due to severe water stress, which can result in a decrease of the harvest index, and a failure of pollination due to cold and heat stresses, which also can result in a decrease of the harvest index because we have less pollinated flowers. In the last step, let's now look at the water stresses before the reproductive phase. In AquaCrop, the water stresses before the reproductive phase are correlated with the reduction in biomass accumulation up to the start of flowering. When there is no water stress, we have optimal conditions, and at the start of flowering, a certain amount of biomass is produced. That's the potential biomass which could be produced under optimal conditions. Let's call that the reference biomass, B0. However, due to water stresses, the actual biomass produced at the moment of flowering was much less. Let's call it B. AquaCrop is now going to consider the relative biomass, the ratio between the biomass produced and the reference biomass, as an indicator for the water stresses. Now the indicator can vary between 1, when there were no stresses, and 0, when the crop didn't grow. Here we see a graph in which the effect of the stresses is expressed by means of the multiplier. Now, when there were no stress, the multiplier is 1 and the harvest index is not affected. When the stresses are light, then the harvest index is going to increase. However, when the stresses becomes more and more severe, this has no longer an effect on the harvest index. so there is a limited range in which the harvest index can be adjusted. Once again, the increase of the harvest index and the period in which the harvest index can be adjusted are conservative crop parameters, and they were calibrated by FAO. So the increase of the harvest index depends on the magnitude of the relative biomass production at the moment of flowering. Water stresses before the reproductive phase can hence increase the harvest index. Let's now give an overview of all the stresses affecting the yield formation. If we have water stresses before the reproductive phase, this might result in a positive increase of the harvest index. Stresses, water stresses or temperature stresses during the flowering might result in a failure of pollination, and this has a negative effect on the harvest index. During the period of yield formation, if we have a reduction in leaf extension, in canopy growth, this might result in a positive increase of the harvest index. While stresses resulting in stomatal closure, resulting in a reduction in crop transpiration, has a negative effect on the harvest index. Here we see the results of a simulation run. And we can see that before flowering there were stresses. As such, the relative biomass is smaller than 1. This water stress affected indeed the biomass production, and it might result in a positive increase of the harvest index. During the period of yield formation, there were severe water stresses resulting in stomatal closure. The actual transpiration is far below the potential crop transpiration. This results in a negative decline of the harvest index. Additionally, the severe water stress triggered early canopy senescence. As such, the reference harvest index could not be reached, and the reference harvest index need to be adjusted as well. This is explained in this graph, which shows the growth of the harvest index starting from flowering, heading to its reference value. However, due to insufficient green canopy cover, the increase of the harvest index stopped, and we have an adjusted reference harvest index. Let's now have a look at the production tab sheet of the run menu. In the production tab sheet of the run menu, AquaCrop summarizes all the effects. First of all, the water stress before the reproductive phase resulted in a lower biomass production. The biomass production was only 71% of the potential. For the given crop parameters, this results in an increase of the harvest index of 3%. Secondly, the severe water stress during the yield formation, which induced stomatal closure, resulted in a decrease of the harvest index of 12%. The combined effect of the positive increase and the negative increase results in a multiplier which is smaller than 1. The harvest index is reduced by 9%, or the multiplier is 0.91. The reference harvest index is 50%. However, due to insufficient green canopy cover during the yield formation, the reference harvest index could not reach 50% but was stopped at the moment when it was 26%. So, the final harvest index is the reference harvest index, which was reduced to 26%, times the multiplier, which is 0.91. This results in a harvest index of 23.5%. This slide gives an overview of all the factors affecting the simulation of the final crop yield. In step number 1, crop canopy development was simulated. The crop coefficient governing transpiration is proportional to the canopy cover. Hence, in step 2, crop transpiration could be calculated. In step 3, the above ground biomass is calculated by considering the cumulative amount of water which has been transpired. In step 4, yield is calculated as a multiplier times the reference harvest index times the simulated biomass in step 3. The reference harvest index is cultivar specific, but can be adjusted if there is insufficient green canopy cover during the yield formation. And the multiplier can be larger or smaller than 1. It depends on the timing and on the extent of the stresses. Water stresses before flowering can result in an increase of the harvest index. Water stresses during flowering result in a failure of pollination and will decrease the harvest index, while water stresses during yield formation can increase or decrease the harvest index depending on the severity of the water stress.